Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day, I should say, of Onward's 2020 Party Conference programme. My name is Will Tanner. I am the director of Onward, a think tank whose mission is to renew the centre-right for the next generation by coming up with bold and practical new ideas and reaching out to new groups of people. And few issues get to the heart of that agenda, to that mission, as the issue that we're discussing this morning, the decline of the social fabric in many communities and the need to preserve and strengthen local institutions, especially in places where those institutions have been lost or at risk. As some of you will know, Onward has been exploring the strength of community up and down the country since March this year in a big programme of work called Repairing Our Social Fabric. One of the most striking things that we've found out in that work is the importance to local people of what people call hubs, places which serve not only an economic purpose, but places which also have innate social value that bring people together from different walks of life and forge stronger relationships rather than just to serve a consumer need. And I suppose that has become even more important in the last 6 months as we've all been confined to our local areas as a result of the pandemic. These institutions are pretty varied. They might be libraries, pubs, or indeed an institution which we're likely to hear about a lot this morning, post offices. But the important thing is that they're more than just amenities. As I say, they forge strong relationships, they strengthen social norms, they bring people together. And as Onward's work has shown, they have declined in some places more than others. And I think it's particularly notable for the purposes of this discussion that the kind of red wall seats that the Conservative Party won in December and that fell to the Conservatives after many, many years, often in Labour hands, have a particularly fraying social fabric according to the data that we have looked at, and I think local institutions are a big part of that. So I am delighted to be carrying this morning's discussion on hubs and heartlands. How can policymakers and politicians strengthen society and regional economies? And I'm especially delighted to be holding this event in partnership with Post Office, an organisation which really does reach into the heart of every community in Britain. So this morning we will ask some big questions. What can we do to not only protect and preserve local institutions, but to strengthen their role in society and local economies, building on the role that they've played in the last 6 months? As banking changes and high street branches perhaps disappear, what role can local institutions like the Post Office and others play in offering financial services to local people? And what can we do to ensure that those who continue to need cash can do so as financial services become more and more digital? And how can local institutions and hubs be used to serve the vulnerable, especially during the pandemic when they need it most? To get into those questions, and I'm sure many more, I'm delighted to introduce an all-star panel of speakers. First off, we have John Glenn MP. John has been Economic Secretary to the Treasury since early 2018, serving under both this Prime Minister and the previous Prime Minister, Theresa May. Before that, he was a Junior Minister in DCMS and previously a PPS to the previous Chancellor, Philip Hammond. He has been MP for Salisbury since 2010. Second, we will hear from Guy Opperman. Guy is also a survivor of the last government, having served as Pensions Minister since June 2017. He was previously a government whip and has also been a PPS in the Home Office in the past, having been elected as Conservative MP for Hexham in 2010. Next, we will hear from a slightly newer addition to the House, Nicola Richards. Nicola was elected in December to the seat of West Bromwich East, a seat that has not been Conservative since the 1930s. She's one of the youngest Conservative MPs sitting in the House of Commons, and holds positions on the exiting the European Union Select Committee and the Women and Equality Select Committee. And before becoming an MP, Nicola worked for the Holocaust Educational Trust and for Andy Street, the West Midlands Mayor, so brings a regional focus from that work too. And finally, I will turn to Richard Taylor. Richard, you are the Group Communications and Corporate Affairs Director at the Post Office, having joined in January this year, so I suspect you've had something of a baptism of fire over the last few months. You previously worked in senior roles at Scottish Power, Morrison's, and indeed as a special advisor in the Ministry of Defence well. So we have a terrific lineup for you, and now is about the time that I stop talking and hand over to that brilliant panel. But just very quickly, to hog the mic for a moment longer, I just need to set out some housekeeping rules. So first and foremost, for everyone tuning in at home, please feel free to ask questions throughout the session as people are speaking. They will be beamed straight to me as the chair, and I then pose them to the participants secondhand, as it were. Second, if I can ask the speakers to mute on and off as and when you are talking, or not. Obviously, we've all been there. I did it yesterday, but the more that we can mute and unmute, the better, just to preserve the sound quality. And finally, I will finish this session promptly at 10 o'clock, not just to preserve our speakers' diaries, but also because I know that many of the attendees tuning in at home will want to tune into the Onward's next event at 10:15 on Levelling Up, Not Down, London's Role in Economic Growth with Steve Barclay, one of John's colleagues in the Treasury. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to John Glenn. John.
Thank you very much, Will, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. And I'm obviously very pleased to support an event by Onward, who have proved themselves in the last few years to be a really forward-looking, innovative think tank coming up with new ideas. And it's really important that the core of the mission of Onward is the combination of a recognition that the market economy is core to our essence as a nation, but also that we have a responsibility both as a government and as a nation to look after the most vulnerable amongst us. But it speaks to the core mission of this government, which is actually to address the many generations of economic inequality, and that's an inequality of opportunity, as well as investment in infrastructure, social infrastructure, as well as physical and digital infrastructure. And so I think it's great that we're having this session in combination with the Post Office, who is very important in the area that I work in. And one of my responsibilities as Economic Secretary over the last nearly 3 years, which is around financial inclusion, access to cash, and looking at the future of banking. And there's a number of issues there that I think we should focus on during this session. And Guy Opperman and myself co-chair the Financial Inclusion Forum, which is something that's brought together key stakeholders from Money and Pension Service, Citizens Advice, banks, and also civil society organisations, as we look at the challenge of dealing with those in our communities who exhibit vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities have come in different dimensions, but the FCA recognise that 24 million people have at least one characteristic of vulnerability. But we are also seeing significant changes, and the COVID experience over the last 6 months has really thrown those into focus. And it was good to hear about the work about looking at the future of communities. And my colleague and neighbour in Wiltshire, Danny Kruger, has also written a report which I think looks at the resilience of communities and the determination that they've shown to actually support vulnerable people during these last 6 months. So I suppose the question is, how can we address the fact that we are seeing changing patterns of behaviour? And over the last 10 years, I was checking the figures earlier, that we've seen a massive decline in the use of cash. It was 58% of transactions in 2009. It's now 23%, and it's expected to go below 10% in the next decade. And that's meant that banks have not opened more branches. They've radically reduced the number of branches they've had. And that's also led to a creative solution in terms of using the Post Office network. And the Post Office network have an agreement with our banks so that 95% of business activities and 99% of personal banking needs can be satisfied through the, I think it's 11,500 post office branches around the country. But we have got some deeper challenges that have accelerated with respect to access to cash. And that's why in the budget this year, the Chancellor said that we would legislate in due course. But in the meantime, we've got the Treasury chairs a group called the Joint Authorities Cash Strategy Group, looking at how we can both refine the wholesale access process to cash, but also look at how we can have better collaborations. And just before the lockdown in March, I visited one such example in Yarm in the northeast, where we had a community coming together around one of the high street branches, operating as a hub, really, in the community. And you also had a building society working out of a library, where essentially there was a real attempt to focus in on what that community needed, and by supporting an individual bank, ensuring that it didn't move away. And we have to recognise that if we're going to support communities in this way, then there needs to be some coordination from government and some support. There needs to be a central strategy in terms of the banks working together with the post office to have a viable plan of how to provide access to cash across the country. But we also need to recognise that communities are going to have to come together, because it won't look the same in every single place. So I'm very clear that in the era also of open banking and more digital opportunities, we're going to see a small but long tail of people who will rely on cash and won't probably adjust to those new opportunities that quickly. But we're also seeing innovation, and we've got to hold those two things together. But we've also got to attend to the wider challenges of levelling up, when the government has obviously announced a significant investment in infrastructure. But that also means actually being really instrumental in saying, look, there are communities that are ripe for investment, as in investment of new parts of the banking industry. Now, 75% of financial services jobs are outside of London and the southeast. And we're seeing some hubs emerge and centres of gravity for financial services, particularly in Edinburgh and Birmingham. There's some in Cardiff, and fintechs, which is a massive success story over the last 5 to 10 years, are growing up everywhere. But I think if we're going to really bring resilience to local communities, we've got to actually look at ecosystems of financial services, how we can get the right skills and training at local level, but how we can also ensure that actually key functions and key support functions of financial services can be actually almost placed in certain areas where the right situation exists. But I'm always clear when I work with the banks and through the work that we do with the Financial Inclusion Task Force that it is government's role to intervene too. So we've brought forward legislation with respect to credit unions, how we can actually get community development finance institutions to be able to offer more credit options. We're pursuing the interest-free loans that we announced 2 budgets ago to provide support for through Fair for All finance on the ground to help communities that need that support at this very, very difficult time. And then obviously through the last 6 months, the Chancellor has shown a willingness to actually think very creatively about the sorts of economic support packages that we need to put in. Anyway, I'll stop there and pass over to my colleagues, but I hope that gives a bit of an overview of where I see things in the Treasury and some of the opportunities that exist ahead of us.
John, thank you so much. Thank you particularly for your kind words about Onward at the beginning, but thank you even more for setting out such a kind of clear and coherent vision for how you see not just the post office, but the kind of future of hubs locally and their importance. And I'm very struck by your support for local banking as well as open banking, if that's one way of putting your remarks. Guy, can I now hand over to you? Obviously, you are co-chair of the committee with John, but so there's lots of crossover, but you'll also have a different perspective sitting in DWP rather than the Treasury. Guy, you are on mute, I think.
It's been an interesting morning. Am I good now? John is a great colleague, but I couldn't actually hear him because of the joys of broadband deficiencies and the delights of Zoom. So apologies if I repeat everything, but I suppose I'd start with one key thing, which is your glass half full or half empty in this really difficult time? Because in the context of understanding a new community spirit, a new community strength, I believe very strongly that the pandemic, it has something that has brought us together in terms of the way that communities, certainly what I've seen in Northumberland, have come together to try and help each other and come together to try and ensure that the most vulnerable people in society are being looked after. And I've worked at great length with the post office as a minister to ensure that we are supporting the most vulnerable as part of a sort of cross-government group that are really trying to reach out and make sure that the most vulnerable are getting food parcels, are getting financial support. And I support the work that John is doing very much to encourage the ongoing work to make sure we have cash in society, that we have banks being supported on an ongoing basis. So I believe that, and I've read the Onward report, very good it is too, a new understanding of community strength. And I think it makes a lot of very good points as to the fact that the social trust is the sort of cornerstone of that community. And the question for us going forward is, how do we nurture that and how do we build that? And I believe that a combination of government action, a combination of a significant role for the post office, and a combination of local community spirit that all three of us see as members of parliament is the way ahead. So I'm going to tell one quick story which I think demonstrates how you can transform this situation. When I became an MP in 2010, my football team was sponsored by Wonga, the payday loan company, and the banks were closing hand over fist, and we'd just been through a rationalisation in 2009 of the post offices, whereby 11 post offices locally had been closed, but had been replaced by a van that was driving around North Northumberland, one of the most remote parts of this country, to try and see, and at the same stage, the banks were withdrawing because of the credit crunch, overdrafts and financial support to those who were most needy. And the problem of, which we've now fixed to a large degree, of access to a bank account, the basic bank account. So it seemed that we ought to try and something different, so we tried to create a bank. So I've done lots of things as a member of parliament, but setting up and then getting authorization for a community bank was probably the hardest thing I've ever done, because you have to be FCA authorized, you have to be authorized by the PRA. And we set up what started out as Tyndale Community Bank and then became Northumberland Community Bank. And it took all of the great stuff of a credit union, namely making sure people have access to loans and to low-cost finance, but also the availability and the amenability of a local community bank. There are problems with the word credit, and there's problems with the word union, and that's why I think community banks is a much better way to describe them. It's one of the fastest growing banks in the north, and the success of it has been embraced by the Church of England, by the local authority, by the various Citizens Advice and various other community groups who support my local community. We started out in Hexham Abbey, and we're literally one day a week trying to support people who were short of finance and needed loans. And we have now mushroomed into a proper facility based in the most deprived part of the community of Northumberland, namely Ashington, which is the industrial heartland. It's not even my constituency anymore where the bank is based. I'm no longer the chairman, sadly, but I'm an active supporter. And it has taught me that you can have local community initiatives that genuinely transform the way in which that community looks after each other. And whilst other models may work in other places, I'm absolutely convinced that the estates that were previously massively dependent upon payday loans, loan sharks, upon doorstep lenders, are no longer dependent upon those. And we have replaced those, and Wonga is effectively no longer functioning. The reforms that John has brought in as a Treasury Minister have transformed what's called mid-cost credit and high-cost credit, such that the likes of Bright House are no longer preying upon individuals who frankly need our support. So I believe that there's a combination of government regulation, which I think the Treasury have done a good job on credit, a combination of local initiatives, and then partnership working on a local basis to rebuild that social trust, that support network, so that you're then in a position that you've got something to take on the difficulties of your local community. I'm going to touch briefly on the post office as well, because I see an enhanced role for them. I have, as I say, a van who drives around North Northumberland, the most remote part of the most remote county in Northumberland. And at the moment, it's a fairly functioning organisation whereby there's money there, there's an ability to use it as a bank, it parks outside the village hall for half an hour and then moves on to the next location. But I do see an opportunity for such a van driving around the community where small shops have closed, some pubs have closed, banks are obviously closed, to become much more of a social hub. And we're looking at ways in which we can partner with the post office and to try and build upon that so that they can actually bring village halls back to life. The van itself can be more than just a straightforward banking facility on a mobile basis. And I do believe that there is greater capacity, greater social infrastructure. And I will finish on one final thing. If you haven't read Danny Kruger's latest report on a better model of social infrastructure, and this is one of the architects of the original Big Society under David Cameron, I would recommend it very highly. I have to say, I think it is a good blueprint for what we can do going forward. My glass is half full. I believe there are difficulties and challenges ahead, but I believe the pandemic has shown us that our communities are very strong and very capable of addressing some of these very big issues going forward.
Guy, thank you so much. It's fantastic to have such an optimistic glass half full kind of set of remarks from you, and always inspiring to hear about the work that you do in your local area and support some of the most vulnerable people's needs. And I hope that in the Q&A we can get on to how we can do more of that and local action, local initiative to build hubs in the places where they're needed. The next speaker is Nicola Richards. Nicola, could you now set out your 5-10 minutes, if that's right?
Thank you so much, Will. And just like Guy, I'd say my glass is half full too. That is despite some really big challenges that we have in West Bromwich East and Sandwell as a whole. So I just want to talk about a little bit about one area in particular, really, in my constituency, when we talk about the importance of hubs and heartlands. Despite the Black Country having, driving the Industrial Revolution, Sandwell's now the 12th most deprived borough in the country. And net household incomes are £7,000 lower than the English average, and adults in Sandwell are 9% more likely to be claiming universal credit than those living in other areas. So as part of some research carried out by the APPG for Left Behind Neighbourhoods, which I'm a vice chair of, it's clear that areas like Hateley Heath in my constituency suffer from half the levels of community activity and connectivity than England as a whole, and have significantly fewer civic assets, like the post office being one institution that is so beneficial to communities. So in the West Midlands, such areas have under half the civic assets of the rest of England, which suggests that they're significantly lacking in the local hubs necessary to drive economic growth. So there are fewer jobs available in these areas. Unemployment has increased more since 2005 than anywhere else. And as a result, household income is lower and more residents are reliant on universal credit. But residents are also more vulnerable to the worst effects of COVID-19, potentially because of existing health inequalities that we really have to get on top of. And this is where I completely agree with Guy that, COVID has been terrible, but it's really shone a light on the existing inequalities, which means that, we have to do something about it, but also it's very clear where they exist now. People feel left behind. They feel like their community has been forgotten by local and national policymakers. And this has built up some resentment over years, which is understandable. But COVID has very clearly exposed our structural weaknesses, and our regions could not have planned for, a forced shutdown of large swathes of the economy. But many have worked incredibly hard to get back on their feet while we try and bounce back and build back stronger. But to ensure that this local activism doesn't go to waste, we need to guarantee that our brave communities are even stronger and more resilient for the future. Community-led responses to the pandemic are only possible because of the social infrastructure, both digital and physical, that anchors neighbourhood action and enables continued participation in community activity. So if you just look at the community hubs that have provided support and guidance throughout COVID, all the digital connectivity that has enabled us to keep communicating, that has enabled children to keep learning at school, it's things like this that are missing from wards like Hateley Heath, and that's why we've got to focus on delivering for these communities. And as we project forward to the new normal, we must protect and improve the infrastructure here, particularly in the most deprived neighbourhoods. So community life has begun to fray, basically, in these areas, making it harder for people to come together and support one another, and to generally engage in community activity. So there's a lack of community centres that are a hub of neighbourly activity, pubs, libraries, and, you know, in this area in particular, there's no high street, there's no shops, there's very little local employment opportunities. Levelling up transport infrastructure is so important in areas in the West Midlands and the Black Country, and the HS2 project, connecting metro systems, reopening disused railway schemes that are all being undertaken in the West Midlands and by Andy Street, is so important to connecting these communities to better opportunities. But a major part of this discussion will centre around high streets, which is something that the government have already identified as a focal point of many communities, and we're so lucky in West Bromwich East that we're getting a lot of funding. Last week we had the accelerated funding of £500,000 for our high street to start making changes, and there's some really exciting projects that are all about community engagement, engaging young people, about learning skills, and you know, really good things to drive forward the success of our communities. So I'm committed to strengthening the social fabric of communities just like Hateley Heath, in West Bromwich East and across the Black Country. And I'm sure Glenn and Guy would agree that the levelling up agenda can't just be a soundbite. And it's institutions like the Post Office that are really important in ensuring these communities have access to the tools to make the improvements to their lives and their livelihoods. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Nicola, thank you so much. It's really fantastic to hear about your constituency, not least because it's a place that perhaps Conservative Party Conference hasn't heard very much about for many years. And I think the thing that's coming through very strongly from all of the remarks so far, and which I'm sure we will hear about in a moment too, is just that this is about more than just economic infrastructure. This is also about social infrastructure. So thank you very much. Richard, can I now turn to you to give your view and the view of the Post Office? We've heard a bit about post offices from, I think, all of the other speakers, but I'd love to hear it from you as well.
Thanks, Will, and good morning, everybody. And Will, as you suggest, want to just cover both that economic and social impact, which Post Office helps with. So it's a perspective from the high street, which I'd like to give, thinking about what's happening in regional economies, particularly this year with COVID-19, and the opportunity for that hubs and heartlands approach. And I'll do that thinking, again, we've heard a little bit more about cash, and want to get us to think about the right to cash, not just access to cash, but the right to use cash. And that's partly from an individual's perspective, so from a social inclusion perspective, but I think also to think about businesses, particularly small businesses, which can be the engine of growth in our regional economies. So I'll have a look at those as well. But perhaps I can just start with a thank you, firstly to Onward for hosting this, but actually a thank you to postmasters, who've been able to keep over 90% of the network open through the height of lockdown, and that's back towards 100% now. These are key workers who've been on the front line and have provided a lifeline for many people in many communities, whether that is the ability to get their pensions, whether that's to pay their bills, or just to send mail and parcels and to sustain their own lives, or economic activity. So a real thank you to postmasters. My many stories. My favourite, just to give you an example, one postmaster called Azim Sheikh lives in a village in Lancashire, Whalley. He decided to live in his post office back at the height of lockdown because he needed to allow members of his family to shield, but he also wanted to ensure that he served his community well And so he just moved in and just lived in his post office in order to keep it open. And there are many stories like that. So thank you to the commitment which those postmasters bring to look after their communities. So just a thought on that sort of hubs and heartlands approach and the impact on regional economies. And like Guy, I think there is reasons to be sort of half full and optimistic. And that's because place is so very important. And what we're experiencing this year is maybe a shift in the way in which people use place. So clearly many more people are working in the communities in which they now live. And that's having an impact. We, as the Post Office, did some research published at the end of last month with the Centre for Economics and Business Research. And we're looking particularly just at 10 towns, struggling towns in the Midlands and north of England, where previously they were at the bottom of indicators. But what we've seen is that they've experienced actually quite strong growth since that first lockdown from March to April. So towns like Mansfield in Nottinghamshire, or Huddersfield and Wakefield outside of Leeds, they have rebounded in their economic activity, particularly through May to July, compared to that times of lockdown. So reasons for optimism that they can turn around, that towns which are perhaps been in the shadows of more affluent cities actually are having a chance to close the gap with their neighbours. And Nicola would be delighted to have a look at that for West Bromwich and maybe what that looks like compared to Birmingham, for example. So why is that? That's because Post Office as a whole, 10 million customers every week who are withdrawing and depositing cash, sending mails and parcels, paying their bills. And these are essential services which enable more activity on the high street. So perhaps if I may just look briefly at two, we've talked a little bit about cash and banking. Both John and Guy have touched on that. And the simple fact is that there are now more post offices than every bank and building society combined in the UK in terms of numbers of branches. There has been quite a big shift as over a third of traditional bank branches have closed in the last 5 years. Why does that matter? Well, it matters to those individuals, people who need it most, who want to pay in a cheque or withdraw cash and don't necessarily want to go to a city centre to do that, but also for businesses as well to be able to deposit. And we're seeing that in data. We've been using what's known as a post office cash tracker these last few months, and back in August we saw some £830 million of cash deposited in post offices, which was up 3% in July, and amazingly July was up 63% on June. So you're seeing how much cash, as the economy opened up, was coming back and being deposited with us. And cash is important for resilience. We've clearly all had to be resilient through COVID-19, and if we think about not only pandemics, but for whatever reason, if we weren't able to use electronic payments, how important cash would be to the resilience of our economy. So one thought for you this morning is this concept of not just access to cash, being able to just withdraw it from an ATM or a post office or a bank, but actually the right to carry on using it. I'm sure many of us on this Fringe event this morning are quite happy to waive a piece of plastic and delighted that it's now maybe £45 limit for contactless. But for many people, that is not the case. And many shops and places are now not taking cash, and that's effectively excluding them further. And if you're a business, if you think about the whole cycle of it, many businesses will still want to take cash, and they're going to need to be able to deposit it as well. We need to be able to keep the whole cycle and supply of cash working. So it's more than access to cash. I'd argue it's about the right to use it and to keep the whole supply chain of cash going. One final thought on more from a business perspective maybe, but parcels, really interesting if you think about smaller businesses, online marketplaces and so on. We've seen volumes up about 30% in the first 2 months of the pandemic. And we, for example, do a drop and go service, registration for that up 350%. So the sending of parcels is important to people as individuals, maybe to supplement their incomes at this time as they sell things from home. But actually it's really, really important for starting a business and for small businesses. We're doing some new data at the moment. It looks like maybe as many as 40 to 50% of small businesses say they wouldn't be able to survive without a post office to help them to do that. Why is that? Because if you've got access to, if you want to start a business, as long as you've got access to a digital connection, you can get onto the internet, you can start a business anywhere in the country. And if you've got a post office nearby, 90% of us have one within a mile, and you can send anything anywhere in the world as well as do your banking needs. So this could be quite a critical aspect of regional economic recovery, enabling those hubs and heartlands to develop. One final stat, so again, sort of anchor of the high street, the post office, what it is able to do, again, looking at some recent research, which we're shortly to publish, that on their last visit to a post office, 1 in 3 of us will always go to another shop or a cafe or a pub in order to fulfill yet more economic activity. So it truly is an anchor of a high street. So let me close, and Guy in particular mentioned about opportunities to maybe change the model of the likes of a post office to be able to provide more services, and that's certainly part of our comprehensive spending review bid at this time, looking to make sure that we've got the right post offices in the right place, offering the right services at the right time. And at the moment, we're already a lifeline in some 1,400 deprived urban communities. We are that last shop in some 1,500 rural communities, and we want to be able to flex that further, maybe get up to about 12,000 shops, branches of post offices, including in some 1,800 new urban locations. So I think there is opportunity there for us to play that part to help both with levelling up and the economic revival. So hopefully food for thought for the discussion we're about to have. Thanks, Will.
Richard, fantastic. Thank you very much. And some amazing statistics in your presentation. I had no idea that the post office had more branches than banks and building societies combined. That's extraordinary. So we've had lots of questions coming in through on the platform, and I would encourage people to get them in early to ensure that I can get to your question. Before I come on to other people, I'm going to abuse the position of the chair, as is, I think, my right, and just ask one question, which I think is really pertinent to this debate and which comes up a lot in our research, which is that it seems like there is a growing appreciation in policy circles for of what both John and Guy termed social infrastructure, and Nicola, you also referred to this, the kind of the social building blocks of society as well as the economic ones. But it's definitely true, or at least my own recollection from government is it's definitely true that government has always found it more difficult to value or estimate the benefits of social infrastructure as against economic infrastructure. And I just wondered whether or not I'll come to all of the speakers, but in particular, I'd love to hear from John and Guy about how they see people in government, and particularly the Treasury, I guess, kind of thinking about how to value that infrastructure such that we can make investment decisions that are not just in the taxpayers' interest, but also in communities' interest. So can we really value social infrastructure, I guess is the question. John, first.
Well, I think that this has been the challenge historically, that previous governments have put lots of extra money into roads and new physical buildings, but the real challenge to try and open up our to deal with the inequality in economic outcomes is to actually invest in people. And so the bit that's been missing, I think, is that if you've got a series of new glossy buildings in whichever department, somehow you've invested in different parts of the country. Now that's not really the best way of looking at it, because what you want to see individuals getting better outcomes in their lives, and that builds a stronger community. So I see us as having to look across the investment in digital and communications infrastructure, but also looking at community assets, and that's why the collaboration between banks, between post office, and between individuals in communities and community leaders is so essential, because it actually attends to what the prevailing needs of a community are, and they are different across the country. So I think we're seeing a shift in government generally away from this notion that put a new road in, build a new hospital, and upgrade some other part of our physical infrastructure, and somehow that's going to transform the community. We've actually got to get into what are some of the disabling features, and sometimes it's about aspirations that haven't been realised for so many generations. It's been intergenerational worklessness, and there's actually a real need to sort of think up in a joined up way. And I think there's a real determination from this government to actually not be satisfied with that persistent economic inequality, and to go wherever it takes us in terms of developing policy to sort it out.
Thank you, John. That's a very, very encouraging answer, and I'm delighted that you and the Treasury are thinking in those terms. Guy, can I come to you next, perhaps?
I'm delighted to do so. I obviously think everything government does is perfect, so I totally support what John has said, although I genuinely cannot hear him. That's a slight technical hitch. So you're getting a totally... so I can hear Nicola, I can hear Richard, I can hear Will, but for some tech reason that the gods have decided is appropriate, I can't hear John. So you are getting two government ministers totally aligned, I hope, and I don't suddenly just give forward the version that I shouldn't give. I think, so clearly Treasury control the money and they control the policy levers. I think there is a fundamental problem of all governments, and I don't think it applies to this government, which obviously is doing amazingly and I support totally, or any previous government, which is how do you get a cross-departmental approach that looks at things holistically and in the round. Will, I should just briefly say that I met this fresh-faced individual, Will Tanner, when I was a PPS at the Home Office, and he was a policy advisor, civil servant, and hasn't he come far? But from working in government, Will, how difficult it is to get all the departments to look at the impact of their policies and their impact on a local level. And Post Office is a good example. It is funded by one department, it reports to another, it impacts on so many different aspects, and in reality, it's on the high street. So it's miles from Westminster on a localized level, and it depends on the individual postmaster. I love the tale of Richard's tale of the chap from Lancashire who slept in his post office to make sure that that local people were being served particularly well, and his wife was shielded. So trying to implement policy, pull the lever in Westminster, which then is felt on Main Street and High Street, is really, really difficult. I think there is a couple of policy suggestions I would make, which is to misquote a former comedian, why can't we be a bit more like the French? I think if you look at the mayor example in France, there is no doubt that the French government support the individual local mayor and allow them to do things locally in a way that we don't quite do. Now, I think we're beginning to change that because we're implementing regional mayors, the amazing Andy Street, who I know Nicola worked for, or Ben Houchen, who's doing transformational work in Teesside. Some other ones are doing as well. There are Labour mayors who are doing well as well. But my point is that I think the devolution of power and then implementation of that power to assist local communities does make a difference. And I think the French government have got a system whereby they literally give a grant system direct to the local mayor of a tiny, tiny village. I mean, we're talking hamlets of 50 to 100 people. That mayor has quite a budget to make it go forward. We're not doing that policy, but we are doing it through regional mayors. And I think the regional mayor is then passing that money down. I'd go one step further because there's already a system, and I'll finish on this one point. There is already a system whereby most local authorities have what's called members' budget. So in my local authority in Northumberland has a 15,000 a year members' budget that every county councillor, and we have 67 county councillor, can spend on capital projects and deserving projects to improve their local ward. So that's 15,000 spent in each 4,000 member ward in a way that genuinely is transformational, because that local county councillor can see that an individual school needs a new whiteboard, or that an individual community needs a new bus stop. And that money is spent really, really well, really interestingly. And I think there is a way for relatively small amount of money for local government to empower county councillors more to support their local communities. And I look at the great work Rob Jenrick's doing on things like pocket parks, which is a fantastic policy. If you don't know about it and you're listening to this, please get involved with pocket parks. You can bid for money basically to transform your local community from DCLG and Rob Jenrick's team and they will give you £10,000 to £20,000 just to basically smarten up a local area and turn it into a mini park. It's a great policy. It's exactly the sort of thing we're talking about.
Guy, thank you so much. Nicola and then Richard, if that's all right.
Thank you. Yeah, so if you look at the ward that I was talking about earlier, in particular, Hatley Heath, it actually doesn't have bad transport connection, but it also has higher unemployment, higher child poverty, lower GCSE attainment, and greater health inequalities. So there's something going wrong here, and it's not the connectivity infrastructure. It's not the physical transport infrastructure. It's the social infrastructure, and it's about what's actually available to them in that area. And I totally agree with what Guy said about devolution. You know, some decisions are best made locally because you have to understand the complexities of different areas and where needs investment, basically. And if you look at some of the really good things Andy Street has done about investing in people, he's got this fantastic program called Mayor's Mentors, where he's got business leaders to help mentor young people across the West Midlands. He's been a mentor himself too to a young person. And I think also the drive for apprenticeships, because it offers much more than just a job and money. It's about aspiration, and I think it's so important. You know, when you've got a lack of social infrastructure, and it's kind of, you know, it's generations of families that have that have seen the area stay the same for years and years and years. There's a real lack of aspiration that goes with that, and so, you know, it is important that we look at what social infrastructure can be embedded in the areas. There's a fantastic organisation called Onside Youth. That they have youth centres across the country where businesses invest in them, and the council then only have to supply a small amount of money for the most amazing state-of-the-art youth centres. There's one in Wolverhampton that's just incredible, that's providing opportunities for young people that, you know, that money I don't think can buy, to be honest. There's no such thing otherwise. I really want one in West Bromwich, and I would really like one in Hatley Heath, because I think the social benefits would be incredible. So it's things like that I'm fighting for on a local level, and hopefully we can get some funding for. John, maybe you could might like to help with that.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and let's hope that this event was where you secured your funding for local initiatives. Richard, you've worked in both government and the private sector, so you know the difficulties of how to fund kind of what we might term social infrastructure. What's your take on this?
Yeah, thanks, Will. Just two quick thoughts. I think often when we approach social infrastructure, and John will be very familiar with this, you know, most of the numbers we deal with suddenly get very large very quickly, and feel, you know, a bit intangible. So Post Office, we did a study 4 years ago, and in terms of our social value, and it's a nice figure of £9.4 billion. But for most people, that it's meaningless. What is that social value? So we're doing some modelling at the moment, just in time for the spending review, John, which we'll send you. But it's broken down much more by what is that value impact per household or per business, so that we can be a little bit more tangible about thinking about it. So getting it to a scale which hopefully means that people understand the difference we're making in communities. And my second thought is just, again, don't underestimate the things which we take for granted. So as I said earlier, 9 out of 10 of post offices are within 1 mile's walk of people's houses. So as we are working much closer to where we live, if we're working from home, for example, then there is great opportunity at present whereby we're not getting into the car to do these things. So there's actually other value included in a wider social environmental perspective, which, again, we don't always consider when making decisions. Thanks.
Richard, thank you. Okay, so we've got lots of questions coming in from people watching, which is fantastic, and do keep them coming in. I'm going to pose, rather than letting you all answer all of them, I'm going to pose them at different people just to ensure we hear as many as possible. So the first question I am going to select is from Emma Stone, presumably not the Hollywood actress, although you never know, who has said spot on analysis from the panel. So that's fantastic. Thank you for that, Emma. Do you think that we should aim to combine protecting cash with building both digital and financial literacy and inclusion? So is it about both protecting cash and digital and financial literacy? And if I could pose that question at John Glenn, if I may.
Yes, it will always be about the two together, and we've got simultaneous trends occurring. So, we have got this massive decline in cash. Whether it's we enshrine a legal right to use it, the reality is most people will not be using it in 10 years' time. Only less than 1 in 10 transactions will be cash. And digital transformation is phenomenal, and older people are more and more becoming more familiar with it, and we're on a journey of change. But we have got to make sure cash is available everywhere. But you mention the whole point around financial education and so on, and Money and Pension Service are doing some great work to try and bring more coordination with the banks and with their own work in this regard. We do know that it's best if younger people at school age can become familiar with money and how to use it and how to look at how to save. And that's why we've got products like Help to Save, which is available to everyone on universal credit, on working tax credits. Massive boost to their savings of 50%, which is phenomenal, which I commend people to look into. But I do feel that we're seeing transformation from the open banking world, where more and more products, more and more tools to help people manage their money will become more available to people across all income scales. So we've got to be creative, not just use the infrastructure that we have with the excellent post office network, but also be ready to upgrade our thinking about how we can maximize the opportunities of technology to use money in a more effective way. And cash will always be part of the mix, but it will be a reduced phenomena in the decade ahead.
John, thank you. Okay, the next question I'm going to direct at Nicola, if that's all right, because I suspect you'll have quite an interesting perspective on it, which is from Chris Butcher, who is asking, community hubs of all kinds can be used effectively for adult education and skills, especially in disadvantaged areas. He's asking, will this role feature in the FE white paper, which you may not be able to answer, but could you talk a little bit more about how hubs could play a greater role in adult education and skills, and perhaps your thoughts on some announcements the government's made in the last few 10 weeks?
Yeah, I'm not best placed to comment on the white paper, but it's so important. I'm actually doing a piece of work at the moment on careers advice, and it is based around looking at what careers advice happens at school. But it's really interesting that people go through several careers in their lives, and where there's an area of low unemployment, it's likely to be an area where there is the most need for people to reskill and retrain, and don't have either the access to it or they're not aware that they do. And so that's where I think the social infrastructure is really important, because it's quite often about signposting. We've got a fantastic college on our doorstep, which really isn't very far away from this ward that I keep talking about. It's a really short journey. It's walkable to Sandwell College, where they offer incredible courses. And we talk about maybe building a new hospital isn't just the solution, but we've got a new hospital coming in Sandwell, the Midland Met University Hospital, and the opportunities that is going to afford the community in the whole of Sandwell and the Black Country is incredible, because you've got institutions like Wolverhampton University that now want hubs in Sandwell where they can train people of all ages to go into the health industry, and part of it, like I said, is about signposting. But the Prime Minister's announcement last week, I think, is fantastic, and we've just got to make sure that the people that need it most are aware of it. And I suppose that's the challenge for people like me, to go out to these communities and make sure that they know these opportunities are available.
Thank you, Nicola, and I completely agree. We need to ensure that, especially those people who need it, who may not be the people who'd hear about it ordinarily, are aware of those opportunities. Okay, fantastic, Richard. This question is for you, and I'm just going to I'm actually going to combine two questions because they're quite similar, which is so Keel Robinson has asked, do you think a lot of these institutions need to evolve? How can they think outside the box and move into areas that they've never previously thought of or considered? And then there is another question which perhaps kind of provides some of the answer, which is, can we develop a policy for funding community centres to combine post office funding with volunteer funds and build these into community halls? So kind of, can post offices become more of a kind of even more of the heart of the community than they are? So just touching on those two questions, what's your response?
Yeah, so plenty of opportunity to do that, and we're looking at making sure, as I say, we can be more flexible in our formats and be in places where people want to transact. So for likes of Guy's constituents up in Hexham, to be able to not only just have a van come, but maybe where is it that they are assembling as a community, and to be able to help serve them there. So we are seeing more post offices appearing in either actually community shops, in pubs, partnering with libraries, potentially pharmacies as well. So we need to be where people are. It can't be fixed in that way. So in terms of the funding for that, then we operate as a franchise effectively. That's the vast majority of our post offices are agents themselves. So it's finding a franchise model which works for them to be sustainable, and for us as the Post Office Limited to ensure that we've got essential services which people want to come and transact with, to be able to pay their bills, get their cash, and send parcels. One final thought is the extent to which we can do that in a more community way. So how can we partner actually with the banks, for example, as they are leaving the high street, but where more financial advice is required than a postmaster would be able to give, thinking about from a regulatory perspective, how can we do that so that the banks could come and be in a post office, for example, on a rotation basis through the week, so that you could get that advice locally rather than again having to travel as a customer for quite a long distance. For those people who don't want to do that by telephone, for example, and see somebody, let's be innovative, let's think about these things. Lots of opportunity ahead.
That's really interesting, that's something I'd kind of never thought of. Okay, fantastic. So Guy, your question, which follows on from your remarks actually, but Amanda Martin has asked, our town has recently lost 2 of its 4 post offices, including one on the high street. Should other community hubs take on that role? So we've talked a bit about how post offices can take on roles from other organisations, but where post offices are kind of closing, is there an opportunity to shift some of those services elsewhere as well?
So in short order, yes is the answer. Logistics are difficult, and it needs to have one person driving it forward, normally the local authority or the Member of Parliament, to try and get everybody in a room, obviously in a socially distanced way. But I genuinely feel that these things are doable, because I've seen what's happened in Northumberland, and it takes a lot of work. It requires, no disrespect to Richard, who I'm sure is completely can-do in his approach, it does require a very positive mindset from post office, and this model holds that back, because of course if you are a central hub with a franchise system, then there is a degree to which each individual franchise has got to fend for itself. So it does require the post office to recognise there's a problem and have a can-do approach to that. Now, I'm absolutely certain that will happen going forward in Amanda's case. I think also it's an opportunity as well. If you've got a disjointed community where high street post offices are disappearing, where certain banks are rationalising their estate, where local authorities are not necessarily able to support libraries and the like, then come together and actually have a realistic assessment of how it is you can amalgamate all these services that people value and just find the right location for them going forward, because the local authority clearly should drive that forward as a sort of the presider and provider of so many other things. We see it in job centres, whereby in a job centre, if I have the local authority providing housing support and I have citizens advice also in the job centre, I know the service to the customer is going to be way, way, way better, because the individual customer is going to come in and get all the services in one integrated hub. And particularly the vulnerable customer is going to be able to go and say, well, I can get my my benefit here, my job support here, but I can then also sort out my housing with Fred over in the corner from the local authority who's got the housing association as well. And so the more integrated your hub, the better you will be, in my view, and the better the commercial model, because all of these organizations are struggling to pay rent, they're struggling to get access and disability access, they're struggling to do all the things that we need to do on a ongoing basis, but integrate into one hub. So my personal view is I would be looking to take your 4 post offices down to 2 and possibly even down to 1, but make it especially a good one, integrated in a much bigger way, possibly with outreach. I really recommend the van driving around a community is a fantastic way of providing these services, and relatively cheap for the post office as well.
Guy, thank you so much. That's fantastic. So we've got a few more questions coming in. So Fiona Cuthbertson is asking a question, which I think I'm going to pose to all of you, because I think it is something which probably does require a bit of thought. And I think a number of you might have different comments from each other, but which is the difference between rural and urban environments and communities, and whether or not we need a different type of service and potentially a different type of funding model for rural post offices compared to urban post offices. So Fiona asked very specifically, rural post offices rely on the post office subsidy to provide services for vulnerable people, but its future is not assured. When will this change? But I guess that speaks to a wider question, which all of you might be able to answer, which is, do we need to think differently about rural communities compared to urban communities? And is there kind of considerations that government needs to take into account as they think about funding these services? So I think, John, you have not answered a question for some time, so let me come to you first, and then maybe I'll go to Richard, Nicola, and then Guy.
Well, I think we need to see this in terms of a national network, and I'm very nervous of creating a urban-rural classification split, because I think it doesn't do justice to the ambiguities that exist, and there'll be lots of people saying, oh, well, we're really rural when they're not classified as such. And I can see that being really troublesome. But what I would say is that I echo Guy's comments. You need to have a future-proof model that actually goes beyond the immediate challenge and actually says what's going to provide resilience in the medium to long term here. And clearly rural communities, and like Guy's and parts of mine, operate in a different way, but the distance between some of my rural communities and in my case Salisbury is not so far, and that means that Salisbury can act as a hub. Now that won't be the case when the actual large villages that exist in sparsely populated areas can't even hold that number. So that's why you've got banks having taking vans around on certain days. We will just have to get used to a different type of service in different areas. We can't have a one-size-fits-all model, which also speaks to this whole point. I think one of the previous questions was, is there money available to roll this out, in terms of community hubs? No, there needs to be an open mind with respect to what we need to provide in some areas, but also it's about the collaboration. The banks, are on a journey of reducing their footprint across the country, but they also need to access their customers. And for some of their customers, that physical interface is going to be critically important. Otherwise, they'll lose that connection and they'll lose customers. So they're up for it. And often in communities, we've got, libraries, village halls, community buildings that are there underutilized. And so, I agree with what Guy said. It is about actually having local drivers of change that enable those things to happen. But I don't want to, lose the thrust of the question. There is a rural challenge, and the connectivity thing around full fibre and broadband generally is a massive obligation on government to get right, because that will actually maintain the connectivity over the next few years and allow some of these options, these innovative options to take root in communities at the moment probably aren't so aware that they could provide the answer.
John, thank you very much. Richard, can I come to you next?
Yeah, I agree with John has said. It's very hard to characterise it as sort of rural versus urban. We do need to make sure that we've got flexibility to deliver the right service in the right place, and also at the right time, which I'll just explain now, because as Guy says, particularly for the rural communities, then we rely a lot at the moment on a van going around, but we probably need to think that through in terms of, is that always the right answer if it's only providing a service for 1 or 2 hours a week? For many people that isn't sufficient, and actually there may be other places which they already travel to where we could provide a service for longer, and we've just got to try and get that right, recognising those access criteria which we rightly have as a post office serving the whole of the United Kingdom. My other reflection on it would be that clearly the situation continues to change, particularly in urban environments at the moment. So if you think about automatic teller machines, ATMs, we've probably got too many in city centres at the moment. It's much easier to have them in a city centre where at the moment fewer people are going. We have less of them in suburban or rural areas, and so we'll probably need to think about that, or other ways in which people can get hold of their cash. And certainly from a post office perspective, we know at the moment we actually under index in suburban areas, in particularly urban deprived areas. There's more which we could do to help sustain urban deprived areas, suburban areas, by having a different shape of network than we currently have, which is still traditionally very sort of city centre based and then working its way outward. So we're going to have to be quite thoughtful to get this right, recognising to an earlier question that from time to time there's going to be churn in postmasters, and some post offices will close and reopen. So we've got to take that as an opportunity, get the model right for the services which customers want, right place, right time, right service.
Thank you, Richard. Nicola.
Thanks. I suppose my take on this is that it doesn't matter, where you live or what kind of community you're in, that you need some form of local hub. And there's parts of my constituency, there's an area kind of in between Birmingham city centre and West Bromwich town centre that is probably the least deprived part of my constituency, yet feels so left behind because it has so few local shops and banks, and they're kind of stuck between two places and don't feel that they belong to either of them. And recently, actually, the post office was due to close. They have a post office there, and I'd like to think it was my lobbying that stopped it from happening, and it's going to remain open. But I suppose every community wants these local institutions and local hubs, whether they're rural or not. I can't comment on what it's like to be in a rural community. I've never lived in one. I grew up in the Black Country. But yeah, so that's my take on it. And I suppose the other thing is that while we're still rolling out full fibre broadband to the whole country, there's areas that when they can't go to a physical place like the post office, can't also do these things online at the moment, and that doesn't just affect rural communities. There's parts of my constituency that have really poor internet connections still. So there's still an important place for physical post offices.
Nicola, thank you so much. That's fantastic. Guy, what's your take on the rural-urban split? You obviously have a very sparsely populated constituency, so you might have a unique perspective on this.
So if I tell you that I've got some communities which are 20 miles from a post office, you will realise that the reality of Richard's 90% are within 1 mile is light years away from that. And I've got a county council ward of 4,000 people spread over several hundred square miles. So these are not easy challenges to face, but it is all very good. I'm going to flip the question around because I have someone texting me what John says, and I agree with him on libraries. I think we are as one, although I can't actually hear him live in this chat. There we go. I'm going to turn this around and say the question surely is, as a government and Nicola, John and I are all part of the government, is how do you bind the social fabric of your community together, irrespective of whether that is an urban ward or a quasi-urban ward in West Bromwich, or whether it is part rural in Wiltshire, or it's super rural in Northumberland. And I don't think it really matters. And I take John's point that there is to be an approach for all the country, and we govern for all the country. But I think the practical implication is very different in my view, in that I'm certain that what Andy is doing so successfully in West Midlands is sort of empowering local communities, partly with funding, but also with support. And I'm certain that we can have in a rural community a similar approach. It's harder, but it's not impossible to do. And so for me, it's an exam question, is how do you bind the social fabric of your community together? You then turn around and say, if that is what it looks like, and we all agree it should be a hub where the post office, where shops, where social interaction can take place, and people still feel a sense of community and village that exists, whether you're in an urban or a quasi-urban context, then that's the answer to the question. And then the implementation of the policy should take it from there. I do think that devolution is utterly key to be able to make this happen. And the more localized the recommendations, so for example, we all know that a parish council has relatively little power. I would empower parish councils to be able to bid for funding, which would then make a difference on a localized level. Now, that funding would have to go through a regional body. But I think if we did that, you'd be slightly closer to the French mayoral example. You'd be empowering that local community more, and you would make a parish council that much more important to your local community.
Guy, thank you. You are speaking from the Onward hymn sheet when you talk about the importance of parish councils and hyperlocal governance, indeed. Although it's still a travesty that large parts of, or some parts of the UK don't even have parish councils, and far fewer have business improvement districts and other similar hyperlocal governance arrangements. I am going to bring the session to a close now to protect everyone's diaries, as I said at the beginning. But before we end, I should both sum up and pass on my thanks to the speakers. I am so grateful for all of you giving up an hour and a bit of your time on a wet and windy kind of autumn morning, and doing so from home through a Zoom screen rather than in person at party conference to boot. It's really brilliant for an organisation like Onward, which is still very young and still finding its place in the world, to be able to host events like this and to be part of such a kind of brilliant informative discussion. And I'm really grateful to everyone who tuned in at home as well. Just to sum up, some really key things came out of today for me. Firstly, and most importantly, the kind of glass half full approach that Guy set out, that Nicola reinforced, and I think all of the comments stressed a need to look on the bright side and not be too gloomy about the world, and also think about how we can be forward looking and innovative rather than kind of nostalgic and backward looking. There is, I think, as this discussion illustrated, huge opportunity to innovate local services, deepening and strengthening that local connection and the importance of local institutions, even as services go online and become more digital too. And I think lots of the statistics in Richard's presentation actually reinforced that, gave kind of concrete evidence of how that is happening in real time, and including during the pandemic. Clearly the post office is at the heart of that. We've talked a lot about the post office this morning, but there are other hubs and institutions available too, and I think the discussion really spoke to how local organisations and places can be that kind of focal point for local people to come together to get vital services, and also to forge strong relationships which sustain the social fabric of a place over time, and a need for government to reinforce and kind of recognise that, in particular through better appraisal of the value of that type of activity, which is clearly an ongoing challenge, which I hope Onward can contribute to in the coming months. And just finally, a kind of clear recognition from all of the panelists that access to cash is of continuing importance. Clearly, really good work is being done in government, not least by Guy and John. But there is probably more to do in terms of maintaining that access and ensuring that those who need cash, especially at a time like this when cash actually comes with some risks, especially for certain groups, the access to cash is preserved. Thank you all for giving your remarks. Thank you in particular for Guy and John for giving up their precious time. It's not often that you get two ministers on a panel together, certainly not every day for us at Onward. So it's a great privilege for us to host you both this morning. Thank you to Nicola for giving us an insight into the type of challenges faced by red wall seats, and your seat in particular, Nicola. It was really fantastic to hear that, and I hope we can follow up. And thank you to Richard and the Post Office for not just your remarks, which were fantastic, but also for partnering with Onwards in the first place and making this event a reality, because without your help and support, we wouldn't have been able to do it. So thank you all. Just as I let you go, just a reminder that in 15 minutes, Steve Barclay will be talking to Anthony Brown, MP, Lizzie Burden from The Telegraph, and Catherine McGuinness from the City of London about levelling up, not down, London's role in the regional economy. So tune into that in a moment, but until then, I'll bid you farewell and thank you again.
Thank you.